The slap heard round the world. The heavy oak doors of Jefferson County Courthouse creaked open, releasing a stale gust of air as the morning's first cases filtered in. The marble floors echoed every shuffle of shoes, every nervous tap of fingers on courthouse benches, and every whispered prayer sent skyward by defendants desperate for mercy. The air was thick with tension, something Ava Winton felt the moment she stepped into the hall. Her pulse thrummed against her eardrums, a soundtrack to her unease. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Dignity isn't how you stand when everything's right. It's how you stand when everything's wrong. She clutched the smooth leather strap of her satchel, her thumb tracing the seam with precision. Ava was only 16, but today she felt ancient. Beside her sat Maya Johnson, her best friend since kindergarten, who offered a steadying hand. Maya's presence was the only thing keeping Ava from bolting for the exit. "You didn't do anything wrong," Maya whispered. "You were just looking at that necklace." Ava nodded, though the knot in her stomach said otherwise. It wasn't just fear of the courtroom. It was the weight of 1,000 invisible eyes that always followed girls like her in places like that jewelry store. The courtroom doors swung open again, spilling out a black man in handcuffs, his mother trailing behind him with red-rimmed eyes and a trembling tissue. No one even made eye contact with him as he passed. Ava squeezed her hands together until her knuckles turned white. The sound of Judge William Alcott Alderman's voice carried through the hallway, sharp and impatient. 20 years. Next case. The words hit like a hammer. 20 years. One sentence for a life erased. The bailiff's voice rang out. Case number 404-08. State versus Ava Winton. Ava's legs felt like lead. Her Sunday dress, the one her father had bought her, sky blue with delicate white trim, suddenly felt all wrong. Too bright, too innocent, too hopeful for a place like this. "Remember what your dad said," Maya whispered. "Tell the truth. Stay calm. Keep your head up." Ava stepped inside. The judge and his prejudgments. Judge Alderman sat high on his throne, black robes framing his thin, sharp frame. His steel-gray hair gleamed under the fluorescent lights, every strand precisely in place. The slight downturn of his mouth gave the impression that everything before him, including the lies he sentenced, was a tedious inconvenience. "Another shoplifting case," Alderman muttered, not even looking up. "You people always have the same story." Ava's hands clenched at her sides. Her throat felt dry, but she stepped forward. "I wasn't stealing," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I was just looking at a necklace for my mom's birthday. I didn't touch anything." Alderman raised an eyebrow, finally glancing at her over the top of his wire-rimmed glasses. His eyes swept over her like she was an insect pinned to glass. "Spare me the speech," he said. "I've been on this bench for 30 years, and I know a thief when I see one." Ava opened her mouth to respond, but the prosecutor, a pale, oily man named Spencer, cut her off. "Your Honor, the security footage clearly shows suspicious behavior," Spencer said, holding up a USB drive like it was a holy relic. Lingering near the display cases, avoiding the clerk's gaze, a small TV cart was wheeled forward, and grainy footage flickered to life. It was chopped, blurry, out of context, showing Ava standing near the case, moving between aisles, then lingering again. Ava's heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear. "That's edited," Ava's court-appointed public defender, Angela Martinez, objected. "The full footage shows her speaking with the sales associate." Alderman's hand slammed down his gavel. "Enough," he barked. "I know your type. Excuses, excuses. A fine young girl like you should be ashamed." The word hung heavy in the air. "Your type." Ava's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled at her sides. "Your Honor, my client has a 4.0 GPA, Angela said, voice firm but polite. "She's never had a disciplinary incident. The store found nothing on her. There's no evidence." "That's enough." Alderman's voice rose. I know all about these honor students who think they can talk their way out of consequences. Ava couldn't stop it. The frustration, the fear, the years of being followed in stores, the lectures from her father about keeping her hands visible at all times, the constant awareness that being seen meant being suspected. It all boiled up. That's not fair. Ava's voice rang out before she could stop herself. The courtroom went silent as a graveyard. Alderman's face twisted in a slow, poisonous smile. Contempt of court. He stood. His black robes flared like dark wings, and before anyone could react, his hand swung through the air with a sharp crack. His palm struck Ava's cheek, snapping her head to the side. A stunned hush fell over the room. The sound of skin on skin echoed like a gunshot. Maya gasped from the gallery. Angela rose to her feet, shouting, but her words were drowned in the stunned static filling Ava's ears. Ava stumbled back, her hand flying to her cheek, the sting blooming into sharp heat. Her knees wobbled, but she stayed standing. Her father's words rang louder than her fear. Keep your head up. The courtroom was a live wire. A dozen phones had shot into the air, cameras recording. Angela was yelling something about assaulting a minor, and Alderman's face, smug and flushed, suddenly shifted as he saw every phone trained on him. The moment hung, suspended in amber, a lifetime crammed into a second. The slap heard round the world. Ava stood tall, her cheek red, her eyes bright with fury and unshed tears, her small body shaking with adrenaline. She didn't know yet, couldn't know, that within an hour, the video would hit social media. That by nightfall, it would have 1 million views. That by morning, her name would be a hashtag, and her story a spark that would ignite a reckoning decades overdue. But for now, she simply stood. Dignity isn't how you stand when everything's right. It's how you stand when everything's wrong. Her father had been right. And Ava, his daughter, stood with her head high, the girl behind the name. The silence in courtroom 7B felt stretched and fragile, like old glass ready to shatter at the slightest touch. Ava's cheek still burned, the judge's handprint branded into her skin like a mark of defiance and humiliation. But it wasn't just the slap. It was everything the slap stood for. Alderman's hand had been the physical blow, but his words were the deeper cut. The casual dismissal, the sneering condescension, the way he'd already decided who she was before she even opened her mouth. Her type. The courtroom was frozen. Even the bailiff. An older man named Wilson, who had worked under Alderman for 15 years, stood slack-jawed at his post. The clicking of Angela Martinez's heels broke the silence as she stormed toward the bench, her folder of case notes forgotten on the defense table. Your Honor. No, Mr. Alderman, you just physically assaulted my client. A minor. In open court, in front of witnesses, on camera. Her voice rang out, furious and incredulous all at once. Alderman's face paled. His usual unshakable arrogance faltered as he realized exactly how many phones were pointed at him, their screens already capturing and uploading every second to social media. Order. Alderman's gavel slammed into the bench, but no one stopped recording. Angela took a deep breath, visibly shaking. You're done, Your Honor, she said, emphasizing the title with scorn. You just ended your career, on tape. Ava stood quietly, her head held high, just like her father had taught her. She didn't cry. She didn't break. Even though her hand trembled as she lowered it from her face, she stood tall. The bailiff finally found his voice, stepping forward. Everyone cleared the courtroom, he barked. But it was too late. The moment had already escaped into the digital ether. In the sudden rush of bodies and noise, Ava felt a strong, familiar hand on her shoulder. Come on, honey, said a voice she knew better than her own heartbeat. Her father, Chief Justice Malcolm Winton. The room tilted. Alderman, halfway off his bench, froze mid-step, his face, red from fury and exertion, drained white as the pieces clicked into place. Ava Winton. The girl he had just struck wasn't just any defendant. She was the only daughter of the highest judicial authority in the state, the very man who could, with a single signature, end Alderman's entire career. For the first time in his decades on the bench, William Alderman felt fear. The first crack in the wall. Malcolm Winton had never been one for theatrics, but the moment he stepped into the well of the courtroom, the air changed. Even out of his robes, in a simple charcoal suit, Malcolm carried himself like a man who was used to commanding attention, and more importantly, respect. His presence was a reminder that the judicial system was bigger than one corrupt judge with a grudge. He took Ava's face in his hands, his thumb brushing gently over the angry red mark on her cheek. His jaw tightened, the only sign of emotion he allowed himself. "Are you all right?" His voice was low, but everyone heard it. Ava nodded, her spine still straight. "I'm okay, Dad." The word echoed. Dad. There it was, confirmation for everyone in the room. Judge William Alderman had just slapped the daughter of his boss. The reporters in the back, once hesitant, afraid of Alderman's infamous temper, now surged forward. Phones held high, recording every detail. Alderman stammered from the bench. "Your Honor, Chief Justice, I didn't know. I mean, there's been some confusion." Malcolm Winton raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture so calm it was terrifying. "We'll handle this properly," Malcolm said, his voice smooth, measured, lethal. "For now, Ava, you're coming with me." He didn't wait for permission. He didn't need to. Angela Martinez fell into step beside them, her eyes wide with realization. Alderman stood frozen, the gavel still clutched in his hand like a talisman against the inevitable. The power of names. Outside the courthouse, protesters were already gathering, alerted by the viral clips spreading across Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. The video of Alderman's slap was already at 500,000 views. By dinner, it would be over 1 million. #JusticeForAva was trending globally. Alderman's name was dragged into the spotlight, not just for the slap, but for the years of whispered stories about his harsh sentences for black defendants, his courtroom bias, his refusal to allow evidence or proper defense when it came to certain cases. The slap had ripped off the lid, and the rotting heart of Alderman's career was exposed. Ava sat silently in her father's car, the leather seats cool against her legs. Her cheeks still throbbed. "You could have told me you were going to that store," Malcolm said, his hands tight on the wheel. His voice was soft, but the anger simmered beneath it. "I didn't think I'd end up here," Ava said quietly. "I just wanted to look at something nice." Malcolm sighed, the weight of the day settling into his shoulders. You should never have been there alone. Not in his courtroom. They didn't need to say Alderman's name. He was a fixture in judicial circles, a man Malcolm had long suspected of racial bias, but had never been able to nail down with hard evidence. Until now. "Dad," Ava said after a long silence. "What's going to happen to him?" Malcolm's grip tightened on the wheel, his knuckles pale against the leather. "Whatever justice demands," he said simply. "Nothing more, nothing less. The investigation begins." The next morning, the Judicial Oversight Board was summoned for an emergency session, a rare event reserved for the most egregious breaches of conduct. The video played on a loop for the stunned panel. Alderman, face flushed with fury, hand raised, striking Ava across the face. The slap wasn't just a crime. It was a symbol. It stood for every biased ruling, every unjustified sentence, every dismissed piece of evidence in Alderman's courtroom. It was the first domino. The board unanimously suspended Alderman, pending a full investigation. But Malcolm Winton wasn't stopping at suspension. He personally ordered a comprehensive review of every case Alderman had presided over in the past 15 years, looking for patterns, inconsistencies, and evidence of racial bias. Within hours, patterns emerged. Black defendants were sentenced to prison at 3 times the rate of white defendants for identical charges. Evidence from black defendants was often excluded entirely. Minor offenses, Traffic violations, petty theft, were punished as harshly as felonies if the defendant was black. Ava had set off an earthquake. The slap wasn't the story anymore. Alderman's entire career was. The weight of a name. That evening, Ava sat at the dining table, her mother and father beside her, while phones buzzed and the news played in the background. She had never wanted to be famous. She had never wanted to become a symbol. But her name, Ava Winton, was no longer just hers. It belonged to a movement now, a movement too big for any one judge to silence. And this was just the beginning. Cracks in the crown. The house felt too quiet that night. Ava Winton lay awake in her room, phone balanced on her stomach, the soft glow casting shadows across the ceiling. The video, her video, was playing again on mute. It had 3.7 million views now, climbing by the hour. Her name trended alongside headlines like, "Judge strikes teen in courtroom meltdown," "A slap that shook the system," #Justice for Ava, the face of America's broken courts. Her face was everywhere. Her pain, public property. Ava squeezed her eyes shut, but her mind refused to settle. Every time her lids closed, she saw the arc of his hand, the flash of rage in his eyes, the moment her body rocked sideways under the force of it. She touched her cheek. It still stung, less from the physical blow and more from the knowledge that he never saw her. Not as a person, just a type. Beneath the covers, her fingers hovered over her phone's off switch, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. Closing the app felt like turning her back on everyone sharing their stories. Her DMs were flooded, not just with support, but with confessions from strangers. "He did the same to me. He gave me 3 years for a broken taillight. I tried to show him evidence, and he refused to look at it. I've waited 10 years for someone to finally see him for what he is." Ava swallowed hard. How was she supposed to carry all this? She heard the quiet knock a moment before the door creaked open. Her dad's familiar silhouette filled the doorway. "Can't sleep." Malcolm's voice was soft. Ava shook her head. He crossed the room and sat at the edge of her bed, his weight shifting the mattress. In the dim light, she could see the worry in his eyes, not just for her, but for what was coming. "This is bigger than you now," he said, as if reading her thoughts. Ava turned onto her side, hugging her pillow to her chest. "I know," she whispered, "but I didn't want to be." She couldn't finish the sentence. Malcolm nodded. "I know." He ran his hand over her hair, a gesture from when she was small and scared after nightmares. "You didn't choose this, Ava, but you have more power right now than any judge in the state." Ava snorted softly. "I don't feel powerful." "Real power doesn't always feel loud," Malcolm said. "Sometimes it's just standing still when someone wants you to fall." Ava's fingers tightened around the pillow. "Is he going to prison?" Her father's jaw clenched. "We'll see. There's more than just the slap now. We're digging into everything. His rulings, his financials, even the cases no one thought to question." Ava sat up a little. "Financials." Malcolm exhaled sharply. "A judge doesn't usually have 3 vacation homes, a private club membership, and offshore accounts. Not on a state salary." Ava's stomach turned. The slap had opened the door, but behind it was a whole rotten kingdom. The kingdom crumbles. Across town, Judge William Alderman sat alone in his study, a half-empty tumbler of scotch, balanced precariously on the arm of his leather chair. The curtains were drawn tight, though it was well past midnight. The glow of the television flickered against his face, where his once imposing features had collapsed into something almost skeletal. Every news station, every channel, his name. The video of the slap played over and over again, looping like a punishment. His phone had been ringing all day. Former colleagues, desperate friends, even his country club revoked his membership. Each message was either an awkward attempt at distance or a warning. "They're going through your cases. The oversight board pulled all your sentencing records. They're looking for patterns. They're finding them." Alderman's hands shook as he poured more scotch, the amber liquid sloshing over the rim. "Damn her," he muttered under his breath. "Damn her and her father." He told himself it wasn't his fault. He had been keeping order, teaching discipline, maintaining the dignity of his courtroom. But even to himself, the lie rang hollow. Because deep down he knew. He knew how often he had already decided guilt before the defendant even spoke. How he had deliberately handed down harsher sentences if the defendant reminded him of the boys who had dented his father's car when he was a kid, or the men who walked too slow in front of his office downtown. And he knew some of those cases hadn't just been about justice. They had been favors. One phone call, one nod over drinks at a charity gala. Sometimes that was all it took to tip the scales. And Alderman liked tipping the scales. Now those scales were turning on him. The avalanche begins. The investigation gained momentum within 24 hours. Malcolm Winton personally convened an emergency task force. 12 independent investigators, forensic accountants, and judicial historians combed through Alderman's entire career. What they found was worse than even Malcolm expected. Over 400 cases showed statistically impossible sentencing disparities between black and white defendants. Evidence tampering requests traced back to Alderman's chambers. At least 2 attorneys admitted off-record that they were encouraged to pressure black defendants into plea deals, even with weak evidence, to save time. And worst of all, sealed communications with private business owners requesting Alderman handle certain troublesome customers, overwhelmingly people of color. One email exchange stood out. "This one needs a lesson. I'll make sure she learns it." It was dated 2 days before Ava's hearing. Alderman had already decided her guilt before she walked through the door. Ava finds her voice. 2 days later, Ava sat with Angela Martinez across from a local news anchor. The newsroom was smaller than Ava expected, but her heart hammered like she was standing in front of the Supreme Court. "You don't have to do this," Angela said softly. "If you want to let your dad handle the legal side, no one would blame you." Ava shook her head. "This isn't just about me." The red light on the camera blinked to life. "Thank you for joining us, Ava," the anchor began. "You've become the face of a national conversation about bias in the justice system. How does that feel?" Ava's fingers twisted in her lap. "It's overwhelming," she admitted. "I never wanted this to happen, but now that it has, I can't just walk away." The anchor leaned forward. "What would you say to other kids? Kids who might be afraid to speak up?" Ava straightened her spine. "I'd say, they can't silence all of us. They want us to think we don't matter. That we're just cases, not people. But if we speak together, if we stand up even when we're scared, they can't ignore us." Angela smiled softly, her pride evident. "And Judge Alderman?" The anchor pressed. Ava didn't flinch. "He can't hide from what he's done. He doesn't get to decide who we are anymore." The interview ended, but the clip exploded online. Her words were more than personal. They were a rallying cry. Storm morning. That night, Alderman's house stood dark, the curtains closed. But inside, the glow of his shattered kingdom flickered across his haunted face. And in homes across the country, Ava Winton's voice rang out, clear and unshakable. "He doesn't get to decide who we are anymore." And with those words, the walls came tumbling down. The fall of the untouchable. The house was silent, but William Alderman's mind was loud. Too loud. He sat alone in his dark-paneled study, the soft flicker of the television the only light. His once pristine desk was now cluttered with half-empty glasses, wrinkled newspapers, and printouts of headlines screaming his name. DSGRACEDGUDG UNDURINVESDIG 4 SOISTENIC bias. Hashtag Justice for Ava Spare Case National Movement. Alderman's Record under scrutiny. Into reads of cases. To be or EVIEWG. The words blurred together, twisting into a wall of judgment. Not the kind he was used to handing down. No, this was the judgment of the world, and for the first time, he was the one on trial. His hand shook as he reached for the remote, turning up the volume just as a familiar face appeared on screen. Ava Winton. She sat across from a news anchor, her face framed with quiet dignity. Not defiance, something heavier, more certain. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a voice, a symbol, a reckoning. The anchor's voice filled the room. Ava, you've become the face of a national conversation on judicial bias and racial profiling in the courtroom. How does it feel knowing your case has opened the floodgates? Alderman's fingers tightened around the glass in his hand, the crystal trembling. Ava's voice was clear, steady. I didn't want to be the face of anything. I just wanted to tell the truth. But now, if my story helps people see what's really been happening in courtrooms like Judge Alderman's for decades, then maybe it's worth it. Alderman's heart pounded. Courtrooms like mine. He could feel it. The walls closing in. Not just the investigation, not just the press, but something deeper, something older. The truth. Unraveling the legacy. 2 floors beneath Malcolm Winton's office, a conference room had been transformed into the command center for the Alderman investigation. Stacks of case files covered every inch of the long mahogany table. Screens flickered with spreadsheets, highlighted records, timelines, all painting a grim picture. Lisa Chen, the lead investigator, stood at the front, flipping through a PowerPoint presentation that no one could believe was real. Here's what we have so far, Lisa said, her voice steady but tight. Over the past 15 years, Judge Alderman presided over approximately 1,800 criminal cases. Out of those, 62% of black defendants received maximum sentences, even when evidence was flimsy. A sharp murmur filled the room. But here's where it gets worse. She clicked to the next slide. In at least 147 cases, evidence was either withheld, edited, or fabricated outright. The room shifted. Angela Martinez, sitting near the back with a notepad balanced on her knee, felt her stomach turn. This was not just bias, Lisa continued. This was targeted, deliberate manipulation of justice. He didn't just show prejudice. He created outcomes. Malcolm Winton stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back, his face unreadable. Angela raised her hand. And the prosecutors, were they complicit? Lisa glanced at her notes. We're building a case file on Elliot Spencer, Alderman's go-to prosecutor for over a decade. His conviction rates were nearly perfect, and more than 70% of his convictions were secured through plea deals. We've already subpoenaed his emails. Angela's pen scratched across her notepad. This wasn't just a corrupt judge. It was a machine, fed by convenience, racism, and unchecked power. Ava and the weight of the world. Ava Winton could feel her world shrinking and expanding at the same time. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing for days. Interview requests, schoolmates texting support, strangers pouring out their own horror stories. Her story had become the spine of something much bigger. At first, it was terrifying. She could barely eat. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back in that courtroom, his hand raised, her body bracing for impact. She could hear the gavels crack, feel the weight of every unjust ruling handed down before her own. But somewhere between the interviews, the messages, and the protests, something shifted. This wasn't just about her cheek anymore. It was about every story that had been silenced before hers got heard. Sitting at the kitchen table, her dad across from her, with files spread everywhere, Ava cleared her throat. I want to speak at the press conference. Malcolm's head snapped up. What? I want to stand up there, with you and Angela, Ava said. If they're going to use my name, I want them to hear my voice. Malcolm studied her for a long moment, seeing something new in his daughter. Resolve. Are you sure? Ava's hands trembled slightly, but her chin was high. I'm sure. The paranoia of power. William Alderman no longer trusted his own house. The curtains were closed. The phone unplugged. He jumped at every knock on the door, every car slowing down outside. The walls were closing in. He knew what was coming. Indictments, lawsuits, public disgrace. But there was something deeper gnawing at him, something no one could see. The voices. They'd started as whispers, echoes of old rulings, fragments of courtroom arguments, names of defendants he'd barely glanced at before sending them away for years. James Wallace, 3 years for loitering. Tasha Green, maximum sentence for possession. A half-empty bottle of Tylenol. Michael Dorsey, 5 years for defending himself in a fight with a white coworker. Their names circled his mind like crows, picking at the edges of his sanity. He poured another drink. His hand shook so badly, the liquid spilled down the front of his shirt. The once mighty judge looked like a ghost of himself, haunted by every life he crushed. And worst of all, he couldn't escape Ava's face. She was everywhere. Every screen. Every front page. The girl who stood when he wanted her to fall. The press conference. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, activists, and curious onlookers. Signs reading "Justice for Ava" and "End Judicial Racism" bobbed in the crowd. When Ava stepped to the podium, the crowd hushed. The cameras clicked. Every phone in the square went up. She looked small standing there, but she stood tall. "My name is Ava Winton," she began, "and I'm here today because of what happened in a courtroom, but also because of what's been happening long before I ever stepped into one." Her voice, though soft, carried. "What Judge Alderman did to me was wrong, but what he did to hundreds of others, to people whose names no one ever learned, that's even worse." Her hands gripped the podium's edges. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever been silenced because of who they are, not what they did." The crowd erupted in applause. Malcolm stepped up beside her, placing his hand on her shoulder. As Chief Justice, Malcolm said, "I promise you, the investigation into Judge Alderman's courtroom will be thorough, transparent, and unflinching." He looked down at Ava, his voice softening. "But today, my pride isn't in my title. It's in my daughter, who stood tall when the system tried to break her." The applause rolled across the square like thunder. In a dark house across town, William Alderman sat in silence, the television off, the bottle empty. He didn't need to hear the press conference. He already knew how the story ended. Beneath the robe, the black sedan rolled down the street in the dim morning light, slow and deliberate. Its windows were tinted too dark for any casual passerby to see inside, but Ava Winton wasn't looking out the window anyway. She was staring down at her hands, her fingers tracing the thin seams of her skirt, the nerves bubbling low in her stomach. It was her first time back at the courthouse since the slap. The protesters were still there, though their signs had changed. Now, they weren't just chanting her name. They were chanting names of others. People whose faces never made it to viral videos, whose stories ended with mugshots, not headlines. "James Wallace," they shouted. "Justice for Kayla Green. Free Michael Dorsey." Ava recognized some of the names from her father's files. Files spread out over the long dining room table at home, stained with cold coffee rings, pieces of lives crushed under Alderman's gavel. As the car pulled to a stop, her father, Chief Justice Malcolm Winton, reached over and squeezed her hand. "You're ready for this." She nodded, but the truth was, no one was ready for what was coming. The House of Cards. William Alderman sat in a gray-walled interview room, his hands folded on the metal table, the skin around his knuckles pale and papery. The chair creaked under his weight, a sharp contrast to the throne-like bench he'd commanded for decades. Across from him, Lisa Chen and a senior investigator from the Federal Task Force leafed through a thick accordion file. "This is just the first batch," Lisa said without looking at him. "We've identified 193 cases where evidence tampering or coercion directly involved either your office or prosecutors you worked with." Alderman's mouth was dry, but his pride kept him silent. "Of those cases," Lisa continued, 62 resulted in wrongful imprisonment, some of them for years. All of them share a common thread: black defendants, minimal evidence, and maximum sentencing. The words were cold and clinical, but they might as well have been a hammer shattering glass. The investigator leaned forward, fingers laced. We can trace many of these cases back to *** direct conversations you had with law enforcement and local businesses. We have transcripts from meetings, intercepted emails, even handwritten notes, all outlining a pattern of deliberate targeting, escalating charges, and prioritizing maximum incarceration. Alderman's lips parted, but no words came out. He remembered those conversations. Some were nothing more than a nod at a golf club. Others involved handshakes in back rooms of high-end steakhouses, where the words "they'll learn their place" flowed as easily as bourbon. Judge Alderman, the investigator said, voice sharpened, this wasn't just bias. This was a conspiracy, a systematic, coordinated effort to turn the judicial system into a tool for punishment, not justice. Alderman's fingers curled into fists on the table. I upheld the law, he croaked, though the words rang hollow even in his own ears. Lisa finally looked up. Her face was stone. You upheld nothing. The tapes that broke everything. The morning Ava returned to the courthouse, the press wasn't just waiting for her. They were waiting for the evidence dump promised by her father's office, the first release of tapes, emails, and confidential recordings taken from Alderman's chambers. The courtroom was full, but silent. Even the air felt heavier. A large screen flickered to life at the front, and the first audio clip played. Alderman's voice, unmistakable, cold, dismissive. You think these people understand anything but a cage. The room collectively exhaled, like they'd all been holding their breath at once. Another clip followed, a conversation between Alderman and Elliot Spencer, the once slick prosecutor now under his own investigation. Alderman, I don't care if the evidence is thin. Push for the deal. They're scared. They'll take it. Spencer, even if it's nothing. Alderman, especially if it's nothing. Ava's stomach turned. Clip after clip played. Snippets of arrogance, of racial slurs casually dropped behind closed doors, of backroom deals between aldermen, store owners, and police chiefs. Her case, she realized, was just the tip of the iceberg. The system fights back. But there was one thing Ava wasn't prepared for. The pushback. For every supporter online, for every voice lifted in the protests, there was a counterpunch brewing. It started with whispers, comments on news stories accusing her of playing the race card, of her father rigging the investigation. Anonymous posts began cropping up claiming Ava had a criminal record. She didn't. That she was a troubled youth. She wasn't. Angela Martinez called it the inevitable backlash of shaking a broken system. They're scared, Angela said as she showed Ava some of the online smears. And scared people smear. But Ava wasn't scared. Not anymore. Alderman's last friends. Across the city, in a private club whose wood-paneled walls had heard decades of whispered deals, 3 men sat nursing their scotch. They were Alderman's last allies. Men in suits who weren't famous, but whose fingerprints were all over the policies Alderman enforced. Developers who made fortunes building prisons. Police union officials who thrived under the arrest quotas Alderman's rulings encourage. Winton's daughter started a wildfire, one muttered. If Alderman flits, he'll give them everything. We need him quiet, the second said, swirling his glass. He's already ruined. Keeping him quiet doesn't fix the mess. It does if we make it his mess alone. They were already drafting the talking points. One rogue judge, isolated incident. The system works. It was a lie, but a useful one. Ava in the spotlight. Ava stood on the courthouse steps, microphones in her face, but her voice clear. This isn't about me, she said, her hand steady now. This is about every kid who was told to take a plea deal they didn't deserve. Every family torn apart because they couldn't afford a good lawyer. Every person who was told their skin made them guilty. Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't falter. "The system didn't break by accident," she said. "People broke it, and people can fix it." Malcolm stood behind her, hands clasped, the proud father and the Chief Justice at the same time. The confession. In his cell, no longer his study, but a concrete room lit by a single bulb. Alderman stared at the papers in front of him. His hands shook, his mind spiraled. It was all gone. The power, the respect, the quiet understanding that he was untouchable. The papers were his confession agreement, not just for what he'd done to Ava, but the years before. The money. The cases fixed. The deals made in shadows. They wanted names. Prosecutors, cops, even other judges. He picked up the pen, hand trembling. Signing this was the final surrender, the admission that everything they'd said was true. He hovered over the page. The pen touched down, a reckoning bigger than one judge. By the time the Department of Justice announced a federal civil rights investigation into Jefferson County's entire judicial system, Alderman's name was just the first. The tapes had opened more than one door. Other judges, prosecutors, even members of the county board were now under investigation. And at the center of it all, standing taller than she ever thought possible, was Ava Winton. She didn't want to be the face of a movement. But if that's what it took, she'd do it. For herself, for James Wallace, for Kayla Green, for every name they were finally learning to say out loud. The reckoning and the rise. The walls in Cell Block D were cold, lined with years of grime and the lingering scent of bleach. It was nothing like the dignified chambers William Alderman once commanded. No polished mahogany benches, no towering stacks of legal briefs. Just a thin mattress bolted to a concrete slab, and a view of a cracked toilet in the corner. The once untouchable judge sat on the edge of the bed, hands curled into trembling fists. His orange jumpsuit, too big at the shoulders, too tight at the waist, marked him just another inmate. Another case. Another number. He'd been booked like any common criminal. Fingerprinted, photographed, stripped of the robe and gavel that had shielded him from consequences for decades. He was scheduled to face sentencing in federal court, and if the rumors were true, more indictments were on the way. Conspiracy, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations stacked higher than the files he once skimmed through before destroying someone's life. And it all began with her. That girl, Ava Winton. The name crawled in his brain like a splinter he couldn't pull free. The confrontation. It wasn't standard procedure to allow a victim to meet with a disgraced judge awaiting sentencing, but Ava Winton wasn't just anyone anymore. Between her father's position and her own rising public profile, Ava's quiet request carried weight. They arranged for a private meeting, 1 hour, in a dimly lit, windowless room at the Federal Detention Center. A battered table sat between them. The door creaked open, and Ava stepped inside. Alderman hadn't seen her since the courtroom incident that ended his career, but she was different now. Her shoulders squared, her chin higher, her presence somehow bigger than before. She wasn't just the girl he slapped. She was the girl who broke him. Ava sat across from him, her hands folded on the table. Steady. She didn't speak immediately, letting the silence stretch until it frayed at his nerves. Alderman shifted, chains rattling at his wrists. "I suppose you're here to gloat." "No." Her voice was soft, but resolute. "I'm here for answers." He snorted. "Answers? I thought your father and his little team already dug up everything there was to know." Ava leaned forward, her dark eyes locking on his. "Not everything. I want to know why." Alderman's sneer faltered. "Why what?" "Why me?" Ava asked. "Why all of them? All those people you destroyed. Those lives you ruined before they even had a chance to speak. Why?" For a moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, "Because I could." Ava's stomach turned, but she held his gaze. "That's it." Alderman shrugged, the chains pulling at his wrists. "Power needs to be used, or it gets taken away. They were easy targets. People like you. You don't have money, lawyers, influence. You're supposed to break. Ava's fingers curled into her palms. But you didn't even know who I was. That was my mistake, wasn't it? Alderman's smile was sour, bitter at the edges. If I'd known you were his daughter, maybe I would have treated you like one of the good ones. There it was. The ugly truth laid bare. The logic that ruled his courtroom wasn't justice. It was convenience, bias, and cowardice. Ava stood. You thought no one would fight back. No one ever did before. Then you never met someone like me, she said quietly. And you never will again. She turned to leave, pausing at the door. You're going to die in here. Not because of me. Because of you. You did this to yourself. Alderman's smile slipped completely, leaving only the crumbling man beneath. The door closed behind her, and Ava didn't look back. A movement bigger than the courtroom. Outside the detention center, reporters were waiting, their cameras trained on Ava the moment she stepped out into the light. Her face, no longer just the face of a victim, was now the face of change. Angela Martinez stood nearby, waiting with a press statement in hand, but Ava held up a hand to stop her. This time, Ava would speak for herself. Today isn't about me, she said, her voice clear and even. Today is about every name you never heard. Every kid who took a plea deal because they were told fighting back was hopeless. Every parent who sat in a courtroom knowing the system was rigged against them. The cameras clicked. Her image broadcast lived to millions. Judge Alderman was just one man, but the system that let him thrive, that protected him for years, that's what we have to change. This is bigger than one corrupt judge. She took a breath. This is about a system that treats justice like a game, and people like me as pawns. Her father stood nearby, silent, letting his daughter stand on her own. We can't fix everything overnight, Ava said, but we can start by making sure no one like Alderman ever sits on a bench again. She stepped back, and the applause from the crowd wasn't just polite, it was thunderous. The sentence, 1 week later, in a packed federal courtroom, William Alderman stood before the bench, this time not as the judge, but as the convicted. The charges were read aloud, each one ringing like a nail into his coffin. Conspiracy to commit civil rights violations, evidence tampering, coercion, assault of a minor, obstruction of justice. The judge, a black woman with steely eyes and a reputation for fairness, spoke directly to him. You turned your courtroom into a tool of oppression, she said. You stripped citizens of their dignity, their rights, and their futures, not because of evidence, but because of the color of their skin. She leaned forward. You are not being sentenced today just for crimes against individuals, but for crimes against the very foundation of justice itself. She paused, letting her words sink in. William Alderman, I sentence you to 40 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted. Some wept, some cheered. Ava sat silently, her hands clasped in her lap, tears in her eyes, but her head unbowed. Justice. At last. The ripple effect. Alderman's conviction was just the beginning. Elliot Spencer was disbarred and sentenced to 10 years for his role in coercing false plea deals. Several police officers, including those who supplied falsified reports, were indicted for civil rights violations. A judicial review board began coming through every case Alderman touched, overturning dozens, releasing wrongfully imprisoned individuals, and reuniting families. The system shook, but it didn't collapse. Because now, people were watching. Ava's next chapter. Ava stood on her high school auditorium stage weeks later, staring out at a crowd of classmates, teachers, and local officials. She was there to accept a community leadership award, but the words she spoke weren't about awards. Power isn't about robes or gavels, she said. It's about what you do when no one's watching. It's about standing up, even when you're scared. She smiled. They tried to silence me. But now, my voice is loud enough for all the people they tried to silence before me. The standing ovation wasn't just applause. It was a promise. A promise that the next time someone like William Alderman tried to turn justice into a weapon, they wouldn't stand alone. Because now, the whole world was watching.